My grandfather died 6 months ago. That is the only certainty I had. I was the one who carried his coffin alongside my father and uncles, even though I didn't want to. I was forced to attend the wake, to listen to the family's laments, to endure the nostalgic stories of those who pretended to have loved that man. I know this because since then, not a single day has passed without my mother talking about how much she misses him, how he was a man of respect, no, a patriarch who upheld everyone with his character and discipline. I know this because my house has been quieter without my grandmother's calls. She used to spend hours complaining about his little whims, and now she only sighs, lost in her own absence. But if there's something I don't know, or rather something I can't accept, it's the way people choose to remember the dead. Because the man they describe is not the man I knew. My grandfather was no saint, no pillar of morality. He was not a guide, nor an example to follow. He was a dictator in his own home, an authoritarian man who never accepted being wrong and who made a point of crushing anyone who dared to disagree with him. And I disagreed. I always disagreed. Our relationship was marked by arguments, insults, and a cutting silence when neither of us had the strength to keep fighting. My grandfather saw me as weak, ungrateful, an insolent boy who knew nothing about life. I saw him as cruel, insensitive, a grumpy old man who desperately needed an enemy to justify his existence. As a child, I feared him. In my teenage years, I started challenging him, and as an adult, I simply stopped caring. The last time we spoke, the argument was so absurd that my mother cried, and my father threatened to kick me out of the house. He had called me over to talk, which really meant insult me. He started criticizing my life choices, telling me I would never amount to anything, calling me horrible names, always shouting. I fought back, told him he was a bitter old man who never had the courage to follow his own dreams and wanted to drag everyone else down with him. His response was a harsh, contemptuous laugh. "You don't know what you're talking about, boy. One day, when life crushes you, you'll admit I was right, and by then, it'll be too late." Those were the last words I ever heard from him. 2 months later, he suffered a massive heart attack and died before he could be taken to the hospital. His death didn't affect me as much as it did the rest of the family. My father was devastated. My mother spent days unable to leave her room, and my grandmother stopped cooking, something that had never happened before. Me, I just felt a strange sense of relief, a feeling of freedom that was soon replaced by a discomfort I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't sadness, nor regret. It was as if something between us had been left unfinished, something I would never be able to resolve. And then the letters started arriving. The first one came exactly 1 month after the funeral. It was a simple envelope with no sender, no indication of who had sent it. My name was written on the front, in a handwriting I recognized instantly. It was my grandfather's handwriting. At first, I thought it was a sick joke, maybe a resentful cousin, or one of his friends trying to play a macabre prank. But as the days passed, the letters kept coming. No sender, no postmark, just a plain envelope, always left in my mailbox, containing words that made my skin crawl. "You're still the same weakling, aren't you? Did you think my death would free you from me?" I could feel the blood freeze in my veins as I read those words. It was his voice echoing in my head, as if he were speaking directly into my ear. The same sarcastic tone, the same cutting coldness. The messages were always short but direct. Each new letter seemed to know exactly what I was doing, what I was thinking. "Do you think you can escape me, boy? I'm still here. I will always be here." It didn't take long for the letters to stop being the only problem. I began to notice a strange smell in the house, something burnt, like charred wood mixed with rotting flesh. At first, I thought it was something on the stove, or maybe a short circuit in the wiring, but the smell would come and go without explanation, always when I was alone. Then came the visions. I was in the bathroom, washing my face, when I lifted my head and saw his shadow reflected in the mirror. It was there, standing behind me, rigid posture, sunken eyes staring at me. I turned instinctively, but there was no one there. Still, the scent of burning lingered in the air for long minutes. The nights became unbearable. I would wake up to knocks on my bedroom door, always 3 knocks, dry and evenly spaced, as if someone were waiting for an answer. When I finally gathered the courage to open it, the hallway would be empty. One night, I woke up with the sensation of something pressing down on my chest, as if something was sitting on me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I could only hear the heavy breathing and that unbearable stench of burning. And then came the worst experience of all. I was alone in the living room, trying to convince myself that it was all in my imagination. I picked up one of the letters, determined to burn it, to put an end to this once and for all. But as soon as I struck a match, the flame died on its own. I tried again, and again. The fire vanished before it could touch the paper. And then a low chuckle filled the room. It was him. I bolted out of the house, my mind in panic. I tried calling someone, anyone, but my phone had no signal. My body was trembling and the smell of burning was stronger than ever, clinging to my skin, my clothes. My eyes burned as if I were surrounded by smoke, but there was no fire anywhere. The letters kept coming, and the messages, once just insults, now felt more threatening, as if he was getting closer. "You can run, boy, but you can't hide from me. Soon, you'll burn with me." The letters started to change. At first, they were just insults, subtle provocations that gnawed at me from the inside. But now they were grotesque threats. They were no longer simple sheets of cold, impersonal white paper. They arrived wrinkled, slick, exuding a metallic and putrid smell. The first envelope I opened made me nauseous immediately. The material wasn't paper. It looked like human skin. My grandfather now described in excruciating detail what would happen to me if he had the chance. Things only seen in the worst nightmares. Things I can't even bring myself to say out loud. Each new letter was a new torment, a new promise of suffering. "I'll make you suffer. Every finger, every nail, every strand of hair. You always thought you were stronger than me, didn't you? Let's see how much you can take before you beg." The paragraphs were smeared with something red, and the smell made me gag. The words were etched into the material as if they had been scratched in with something sharp. My hands trembled as I held them, and every fiber of my being screamed me to throw them away, burn them, destroy every trace. But I knew that wouldn't work. Fire refused to touch them. The flames simply died, as if suffocated by something unseen. I was trapped in this nightmare. The manifestations got worse. I wasn't sleeping anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt something in the darkness, an unmoving presence watching me. The smell of burning no longer came only at night. Now it saturated the house at all times. My furniture started to deteriorate, as if something invisible was consuming it, and the walls grew dark, charred marks that slowly spread like a living disease. The nights became torture. My dreams were infested with horrific visions. I dreamed of being in a dark, scorching place where hands emerged from the ground to grab me, pulling me into a suffocating void. My grandfather was always there, whispering in my ear, describing the terrible things that awaited me. When I woke up, I always found the stench of burning clinging to my clothes, as if I had truly been there. One night, I woke up feeling a terrible pain in my chest. When I turned on the light, I saw scratch marks, red and inflamed, clawing at my skin in twisted lines. The pain throbbed as if something had driven its claws into me. I screamed, trying to tear that sensation away, but it was useless. The burnt smell filled my nostrils so intensely that my eyes watered. Then he began to whisper. At first, it was just an indistinct murmur coming from the corners of the house, from the shadows, from the depths of my own mind. But over time, the words became clearer. He spoke about how my mind was weak, about how I wouldn't be able to escape. "You think you can ignore this?" he whispered one night, his voice coming directly from my ear. "This is nothing. I'm just getting started." I tried to run. I grabbed my car and drove aimlessly, desperate to escape that house, but the smell followed me. The rearview mirror began to fog up on its own, and when I looked, there he was, sitting in the back seat. His face was a distorted mass, eyes deep and glowing, mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "You think you can escape me?" he said, and my car veered off the road on its own, as if something had yanked the steering wheel. I woke up hours later with cuts and bruises, but no apparent accident. The car was intact, but I knew something had happened. He wanted to show me that no matter where I went, he was with me. He always would be. The next morning, another letter awaited me. The envelope was wet, sticky, as if it had been dipped in something strange. I didn't want to open it, But I did. It's almost time, kid. Soon you'll understand what suffering really means. There was no way out. I was doomed. I needed help, so I went after the only one who could rid me of a spirit straight from hell, God. The decision to seek out a church was made reluctantly. For days, I tried to find a rational explanation for everything that was happening, but there was no logic that could justify the letters, the whispers, the nightmares. Something beyond my understanding was chasing me, something I couldn't face alone. The last letter, soaked in that burnt smell, was the last straw. I couldn't take it anymore. The church was an old building, made of dark stone, with tall stained glass windows that filtered the sunlight into pale, cold tones. The smell of incense mixed with melted wax brought a feeling of nostalgia, memories of when my mother took me to services as a child. But in that moment, faith seemed like a distant thing, something I had never truly embraced. And yet, there I was, desperately searching for a solution. The pastor was an elderly man, with stern features and tired eyes, but there was something firm about him, a presence that seemed unshakable in the face of anything. When he welcomed me into his office, I felt a knot in my throat. I didn't know how to start. "What brings you here, my son?" he asked, his voice deep and patient. I hesitated. My hands were cold and sweaty. "I need to confess," I murmured. He nodded, waiting. There was no judgment in his eyes, only expectation. And it was then that for the first time I let out the weight that had been crushing me for so long. "I killed my grandfather." The words came out like poison from my mouth. The pastor remained silent, with no visible reaction. Then I continued. "He was a cruel man. He spent his whole life insulting me, despising me. I was never good enough for him, never." My voice faltered. I took a deep breath and pressed my hands against my knees. I poisoned him, made it look like it was natural. My family suffered, but for me it was a relief. I thought I was free from him. The silence that followed was agonizing. When the pastor spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed bigger than the room itself. "Sin does not disappear with death, my son. Not for those who leave, nor for those who stay." I lowered my head. "I know. He's still here. He haunts me. He writes to me. He speaks to me. I see him. He wants to take me." The pastor sighed deeply and stood up. He took a small vial of holy water from a shelf and murmured a prayer. "Prayer and faith are the only things that can drive him away," he continued. "But your soul must be willing to seek forgiveness. Are you ready for that?" I nodded, even though I wasn't entirely sure. I had no more options. The pastor made a long prayer over me, sprinkling holy water on my forehead and hands. Then he accompanied me back to my house, where he repeated the ritual in each room. He instructed me to stay away for 3 days so that the malignant presence would dissipate. I obeyed without questioning. I spent those days in a small hotel, trying to ignore the fear that, when I closed my eyes, he would return. But to my surprise, the nightmares ceased. The burnt smell disappeared. The silence felt like a balm I hadn't experienced in a long time. On the 3rd day, I returned home with a hesitation that made me stop in front of the door before entering. The air was clean, the walls were normal. No burn marks, no shadows creeping in the corners. The relief almost made me laugh. But then, I saw the envelope on my bed. My breath caught in my throat. My hands shook as I picked it up. The material was different this time. The rough, damp texture made me want to drop it instantly. Still, I opened it. The handwriting was the same, but the words were worse than ever. My eyes raced through the following lines, each word heavy with suffocating weight. "You can run, you can hide behind faith, you can keep me away from you while you're alive, but no one escapes death, my grandson. One day your time will come, and when that day arrives, guess who will be waiting for you?" Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more.